Okay, so thank you all so much for joining in my session. I hope that you have been having a great time and learning a lot at this conference. Even being a Microsoft employee and being before Microsoft, being a Microsoft consultant and strategist, I still learned a lot. There's always new stuff to learn. So I'm glad that you guys are taking the time out to learn new things. So my session is going to be on SharePoint versus Microsoft Teams versus Office 365 groups. Actually, not so much, and I'll explain why I've scratched the Office 365 groups part out. But to talk to you about what should you use when. So a little bit about me. You can feel free to call me Nikki. I'm the worldwide modern workplace tech strategy lead based out of Redmond. So I look after the field of PTAs such as April and Bob and help lead the field for making sure that we have the right strategy going forward for our partners. So I've been at Microsoft for 1 year now, but I've had IT experience since 2001 in a bunch of different areas. And I've worked as a bunch of different types of employee, as well as been a business owner as a Microsoft partner. And you can see a little bit of more of my street cred on the screen. If you have questions, please use the chat window. I will be pausing often though to ask if there were questions that you put in the chat window, but it's good for you to put them in the chat window so that you don't lose your question and then you'll be asked to speak it out loud if you like. If not, I'm also monitoring it on my phone. So if you see me keep looking down, I'm looking at my phone basically to see if I see any questions. Okay, I got to give a little disclaimer. And I'm April and Bob, they actually got away without this disclaimer. But as for anything that's cloud, you got to realize that cloud is always constantly changing. So it can be very difficult for us to keep up with everything, especially when you create a presentation or you do slides. Things change and then things don't look the same as they are in the slides. So please excuse any inconsistencies that will be in any of our presentations. Also, make sure that you note the timestamp on any presentations or videos that you see cloud related. Okay, so now let's jump into it. So our agenda is to talk about what is SharePoint, what is Office 365 groups, and what is Teams. When should we use each? How do you use each of them? And there's a few things I want you to know, and I also have a recommendation for you, or two recommendations. Okay, so basically, what is first? SharePoint, if you're not familiar with it, it is a technology that has been around for a while and has evolved a great deal from being kind of clunky, but getting the job done to being very beautiful and robust and getting a lot of different jobs done. So SharePoint can do things like helping you to share information with your teams and colleagues and even external people that you might invite in to work with your organization or your team. You can manage documents, you could publish reports, um, you could do workflow, there's content types, there's a plethora of things that you could do. But without beating that to death, we'll move on to Office 365 groups, which are based in Exchange technology. So, namely, those distribution lists that you've been used to using for a long time, that's what Office 365 groups are based on. So they include things like the email distribution, of course, shared files, group calendar, planner, and OneNote. And by default, usually any staff member can create it unless your IT turns it off or you happen to be in IT and you decide to turn it off so that only IT can actually turn things on, turn on, create new Office 365 groups. But now, and the reason why I scratched out Office 365 groups is because I want you to think of groups now as infrastructure. It is no longer really an experience that you should be gravitating to. You should gravitate towards using Teams as your primary and SharePoint as your backup or maybe also as your primary. You might decide to use SharePoint as your primary and Teams as a backup, depending on how you use the two. But Office 365 Groups is basically the infrastructure behind Teams. So you want to not use Office 365 Groups, and if you have some, think about transitioning to Teams. So Office 365 Groups, again, like I said, it's infrastructure. So basically, it's behind a lot of different things that you might not even think that it's behind. I said that it's behind Teams, but it's also behind things like Yammer, behind Planner, behind the SharePoint site, can be used there, and Stream. So it's behind a lot of different stuff. So again, it's infrastructure. Try to get away from using it as an experience. Microsoft Teams is based on Skype for Business technology. If you guys remember, it wasn't that long ago, but some people, because they jumped straight into Office 365 and skipped the whole Skype for Business piece, so they might not even remember Skype for Business. But Skype for Business was a technology that was based on Skype. And because Teams is based on Skype for Business, it's more of a persistent chat instead of an email backing behind it, although there are emails that go out from it. There's online meeting capabilities, just like was in Skype for Business. You can share files, you can add pieces, and there are some pieces that automatically come with it, like the wiki and files. But you can add other pieces, like Bob and April had shown you earlier. So the problem becomes with so many different things, Microsoft always gives us so many tools, and sometimes it can be really hard to figure out when I should use which thing for what and how often and so forth and so on. So now we're going to talk about some recommendations for when to use Teams and when to use SharePoint. Just by giving you some examples of what they're good at. So Teams is good at making quick sites, quote unquote, for projects. Um, the capabilities allow you to have conversations like in Office 365 Groups, except for the conversations are persistent on the chat board and not backed by a distribution list. And you also have the ability to add other objects or widgets and connectors and tabs for SharePoint, um, for, well, actually, that should say for Teams, but for bringing in things like SharePoint, bringing in things like Planner, bringing in apps that you might have been built for your organization. There's a lot of different things that you can bring in. SharePoint is for making all those types of sites, including those for projects, but is way more customizable. There's way more things that you can do there. Again, you can do those things, bring them into Teams after they're built in SharePoint, but you can do things like having your project sites, but you can also have intranet and portals and workflow and dashboards and much more. Now, the reason why I say that it's more things that you can do with SharePoint than you can do with Teams is because some of those things would have to be built in SharePoint and then brought into Teams. But that now the gap is kind of closing on what you can have in Teams and what you can have in SharePoint. That gap is kind of closing, but a lot of the times you still have to build it in SharePoint or build it in something like a Power Apps or build it in Power Automate, or bring in other application into your teams. So your team still is customizable in the sense that you can bring things from the outside in, but you might not necessarily be able to build those things directly into Teams. And that's where SharePoint can take over some of those things. So before I move on, does anybody have any questions on this piece? I don't see any questions right now, but I want to make sure. Um, okay, looks like I got it all good here. So I'm going to move on. So some people are saying, okay, how do I get to these things? Well, April had kind of shown earlier how you can get to um, power apps from the home screen in Office 365, but you can also use the some people call it the hamburger menu or the waffle um, or the app launcher, which is really what it's called and is being denoted in this picture, where you could see the different applications such as SharePoint and Teams that you can click directly on. So once you click on the 9 squares in the upper left-hand corner for the app launcher, do you see the widget for Teams that you could actually click on and it would open up Teams for you? Same thing for SharePoint. SharePoint though is gotten a little weird for those of us that have gone from older versions of SharePoint and may be transitioning straight from maybe a 2007 or 2010 SharePoint into this, or even 2013 SharePoint, into this new world of SharePoint Online. When you click on the SharePoint icon here in Office 365, it actually brings you to the SharePoint homepage. And on the home page, that's where you can go click on one of the other sites that you might want to go to. For example, you want to go to your team site, or maybe you want to go to a community site, or maybe you have a site for a specific other job function that you need to go to instead. So you have the ability to navigate from the home page, but initially takes you into the SharePoint homepage. Okay, so I'm going really fast here, and I want to make sure that if you have any questions, you're putting them in the chat window. But I'm going to go through a few things that you really should know about when you're working with these things. So some people don't realize this, but when you create an Office 365 group, if you were to, again, I'm not suggesting that you do so from now on. I'm suggesting that you actually move to using Teams where you would have used groups. But whenever you create an Office 365 group, it creates a whole separate SharePoint site collection. So a whole collection of SharePoint sites is created or can be potentially created, at least the top level of the site collection is created for you when you create the Office 365 group. Because in groups is files, and files are all kept in SharePoint, unless of course you're sharing a file with an individual person, but I'll talk about that in a minute. In Teams, when you created Microsoft Teams, it also creates the Office 365 group and it creates the SharePoint site collection. And sometimes the group that is created might not show up in the group section in Outlook. There's a workaround to be able to see it, which I kind of alluded to here in this second bullet under when you create. If you want to see that, I can definitely show you that in a little bit. But don't be surprised if sometimes you create an Office 365, I'm sorry, you create a Microsoft Teams and you don't see the group that's associated to it showing up in Exchange like you would be familiar with it happening if you use Office 365 groups. Also, you can see the distribution list of all of your Office 365 groups in the Office 365 Admin Center under the Groups option. You can see the teams as well, but you're going to have to be able to get to the Office 365 Admin Center, which means you're going to need to be a global admin, or at least a Groups admin or Teams admin. When you create a channel in Microsoft Teams, it actually creates a folder in the Documents library in the SharePoint site. Now, some people are just like, what? I thought I was just creating a little place in here, and Microsoft says folders are bad. Well, this is the way that Microsoft Teams actually works. So that default documents library and all of those folders that show up in that default documents library that come with the SharePoint site collection behind Microsoft Teams, you want to make sure you don't delete those things and don't rename them. You do that and there's going to be price to pay, a very heavy price, and you're not going to like it. So do not delete them and do not rename them. It causes serious problems. Okay. When you delete an Office 365 group, which you can from the Office 365 Exchange Center, the group will disappear from that list. So if you're an Exchange admin and somebody says, oh, I need this Office 365 group to be gone, I want it deleted, you could go into the Exchange Center and delete it. The problem is, though, that the site collection stays. It may take a long time for it to leave, or it might not leave at all. So you may need to clean that up. Wait some time, maybe about 24 hours, and see if it goes away. Because we're always adding new capabilities in the way things work. This might not be a thing that you have to worry about in the future, but this is something to be aware of right now. When you place files inside of Office 365 Groups or inside of Teams in the Files tab, it actually puts it into that document library that I said in the background in SharePoint. But sometimes it doesn't flow between if the file is not put into a folder that Teams recognizes. So, for example, you could go directly into the SharePoint site collection, put a file in, and then realize, oh, I can't see this file in Teams, or I can't see this file in Office 365 Groups. And it's because you didn't put it in a folder that either Teams or Office 365 Groups recognizes. So just be cognizant if you're using SharePoint instead of using Teams or Office 365 Groups, which I'm going to stop saying if you're using Teams, then you want to be cognizant of where you put that file, because if you don't put it in the correct channel folder, then nobody will be able to see it in Teams. They will only be able to go to SharePoint and see it. When you do a conversation in Office 365 Group, or you do a chat in Teams, they don't show up on either one's message board. So say you do a chat in Teams, something like hello everyone, and you go over to the Office 365 Groups message board, it doesn't show up, and vice versa. And that's because, remember, two technologies based on two other different technologies. One is based on the email exchange distribution list, and that's Office 365 Groups. The other one was built on persistent chat, being Skype for Business. So it shows up on those two separate places, but not in both places, if you understand what I mean. Now, you do get an email alert that will be sent out to the group if they don't check that board after a certain amount of time. If they never see it, the teams or groups will send out an email to make sure that they do see the notification or the message. Is everyone good with the things here? And do you need me to demo any of these things that I just talked about? Because I got about 2 more slides of things you should know. Okay.
Looks like everybody's good. I'm watching the chat messages, Nikki. This is Ro.
Oh, thank you, Ro. All right. So when you're sending an email via a group or even via Teams, really, you will not get that message sent to you because you're the one that's sending it. So sometimes people are confused. They're like, I just sent this thing out on groups, or I just sent this thing out on Teams and I never got a notification in my email. Everybody else did. Or you're the one that sent it. So that email doesn't get sent to you, but it does go into your sent mail box. So you can see it there, and you can also see it on the conversation board as well. Sharing files in Teams via the message board goes to the person that you shared it with, in their OneDrive for Business shared with me section. So if you're in a one-on-one conversation, or maybe a one with a few people conversation, instead of it going into files, it would actually go into the person that you shared it with. It would go into their OneDrive, into the section that's labeled shared with me. But if you happen to be sharing with a team, then that file will go into the team's um, tabs, file tabs. I love saying, trying to explain teams with teams for teams. It's awesome. But anyway, if you're sharing a file with your whole team in a channel where you're talking about the file or whatever, then it will show up in the files tab of teams of that team, not into individuals OneDrive for Business. So there's kind of a difference if you're sharing in a chat, in a way of doing a chat, one-on-one or one to a few people, as opposed to chatting with a whole team. Where the file lands is a little bit different. So I'm just looking here. I see oh, yeah, you like that comment. So Ro was just commenting on my comment about trying to explain the whole teams thing using the words teams with teams. It's awesome. Anyway, moving on. Um, please remember, do not rename or delete the default documents library out of the SharePoint site collection, because there will be a price to pay for that. Power Apps, as April had explained, you can embed or connect to Power Apps in Microsoft Teams. But there's also a way in SharePoint to put a Power App on top of a SharePoint list, so that you kind of customize the SharePoint form, new item form, or the edit form, because it'll give you all the options, the edit, the display, and the new form will all be customized once you customize it using Power Apps. Those cannot be connected to or embedded inside of Microsoft Teams. So you want to be aware of that. If there's something that you want to actually pull data from SharePoint and actually use it in Microsoft Teams as the Power App, then you want to create a Canvas app or another kind of app, but not the SharePoint customized lists app that you might see when you are in SharePoint. For those SharePoint site collections that are generated by teams and groups, I have a whole video that I actually have in my resource section that talks about the differences, but these site collections are not fully featured like your classic SharePoint site collections. So if you were a SharePoint developer or a SharePoint admin, and you know all of the different things that you can do behind the scenes in your site settings, don't expect those when you go behind the scenes to the SharePoint site collection that is created by an Office 365 group that's created by Microsoft Teams. Um, Also, the same thing happens with those communication sites. There is a way around it, though, that I used to do when I was a SharePoint developer and SharePoint consultant. I would actually create the classic SharePoint site collection first, then I'd groupify that site collection, and then I teamify it. And then I switch out the classic page for a modern page. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of work, and it can be a lot of work depending on if you really need all of those widgets in the background. But as a SharePoint dev, I found that most of the time I did need all of those widgets. So I would do it the long way just to make sure I had everything available to me. So later, when the client came back and said, you know what, I need this. And later I'm like, I can't do this because it's no longer available in the way that we created the site collection using Teams, communication sites, or using Office 365 groups. I just want you to be aware of that for those of you that are SharePoint admin or developers and may need all of the richness that comes with the classic SharePoint team site. Um, And you only have the ability to create subsites under your classic SharePoint sites. Not to say that I'm advocating for subsites. That is not something that we at Microsoft advocating for anymore. Having subsites, as you probably are already aware, especially if you are that SharePoint admin, that kept that tried to keep handle on everything that was going on in the organization and keep track those changes, things that were happening in the SharePoint site collections that you were managing. You might have noticed that those sites, when you create subsites, it's a bit rigid. So the answer to that is to use all separate site collections and hubify them together. And there is documentation on SharePoint hubs and how to use those, but basically it's a way for you to be able to, on the fly, rearrange everything that might have happened. Say, for example, you had this department that was under HR, and now it got switched to finance, the finance department, and now you need to move all that data from one place to another place. Well, with hubs, you don't need to move all of that data. You just change the hub parent from HR for that sub department site collection to be finance. And then all the permissions and everything work out like magic. So some things that you need to think about there is not using subsites, but I just want to let you know, just in case you were wondering about those subsites, or for some reason you actually need a subsite. Um, there's a few things about teams. You can have 5 external members that can be added per internal person. So an internal employee can add up to 5 external people outside of the organization, to a team with no additional fee. Now, to my knowledge, at this point, Microsoft is not charging an additional fee if you go over and say you add me, I'm Nikki, I add 7 people to my team. I don't see that Microsoft has started charging for that, but it is in the documentation this way. So you might want to make sure that you're aware, so that if you have 25 people to add to a team, you have 5 internal people, add 5 people each. That way, if a cost becomes associated with that, you're already covered. You can enforce multi-factor authentication on external members, which you probably already saw that Synergy had already done for us when we were added to the team for this conference. You can have up to 500,000 teams per tenant, 250 teams per user. They can be created, except for the global admin who can add all 500,000. Um, why you would need 500,000 teams? Well, projects kind of add up kind of quickly, don't they? At some point, you might get to that 500,000 point. Right now, that's a pretty high number to meet, but you may get there one day. But by that time, we would have given you way more teams that you can create. You can have up to 5 org-wide teams. So you might have heard of these teams that you can create, um, that are called org-wide teams, where everybody up to a certain number actually in the org can be added to the team at the same time. And that way you don't have to worry about trying to add individual people if you're trying to, say, for example, create a platform for the CEO to be able to, and senior leadership maybe also, to be able to say things to the organization, deliver maybe not community, organization wide messaging, and also have that two-way conversation where the members of the team can actually respond back and say, Mr. CEO or Mrs. CEO, I love what you said there, but might I suggest these few other things? You can add up to 5 of these org-wide teams. However, one of the caveats is there's only 5,000 members that you can add to an org-wide team at this point. So if you need a team that's bigger, because your org is way bigger than 5,000, then you want to consider Yammer instead of Teams for that org-wide communication, because Yammer can support way more users to be added. 200 channels per Teams, and that includes deleted channels. So you can have up to 200 channels in your Teams, but remember, any channels that were deleted also count against that 200, which can kind of be tricky for people later. And when you create a private Teams channel, it actually creates a whole new site collection. It's another thing. Do you really want another site collection? Maybe. It might be very important for you to have this channel inside of this whole team, but this channel is restricted to only a certain number of people. Just realize that the whole nother site collection will be created. And the reason why is for permission's sake. It needs to be secured in a way that the people that are in the other parts of that same Teams team can't access the information in the background, even by going through SharePoint. So, excuse me, I think I see a few different things here. So I think there's some questions. So let me go ahead and ask, if you have any questions, it's time for those questions to be asked. Also, if you need any of this demoed, please let me know. But go ahead, moderator, let me have it.
Yeah, and just a reminder, guys, please share your screen. We will throw in a couple of extra entries in for the Xbox. So,
Yeah, I think he means share your video though.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, not share your screen, share your video. Let us see your face. So how about Chapter Champ?
You may need to read the question, Patrick.
Okay, it looks like they would like to know your opinion, Nikki, on let's see. Please comment opinion on your SharePoint Teams view.
Yeah, it was in response to a question that I put around. Do you see people transitioning from the traditional SharePoint team sites to actual Teams deployments, and how common is that now, really?
Well, before I joined Microsoft, I was seeing a lot of stuff. So I don't know how things are at this juncture since my role has changed. But talking about it from my past experience is that um, the usage of SharePoint did not go down. The usage of SharePoint pretty much stayed the same, but deployment of Teams went up. As you can see from the number of users, active users that has been exploding even now, especially with the coronavirus. But it's not really a or situation when it comes to Teams and SharePoint. It's I have SharePoint. I want to use something that's a little bit more collaborative and use SharePoint as my data, back in the day, workflow and info path, but not so much anymore. My data, my intranets, my site for communication, communications at a broader level, um, and then Teams for collaborating on projects. So more of we're on the team that develops this product for our customers. So we want to make sure that we have a place that all of our conversations are being kept. We can get to our files easily in SharePoint. If we have different automated processes that were automated in Power Automate, they can be brought into Teams easily. If we are visualizing our data on a Power BI platform, we can bring that into Teams as well and visualize it there. We can also visualize it in on a bigger canvas, perhaps in SharePoint. And if we have Power Apps, we can easily bring those Power Apps into SharePoint and use them there, as well as using them in SharePoint. So I haven't seen it as okay, Teams is here, let's get rid of SharePoint. Let's never use SharePoint again. Some may say that and kind of start off with that, and then they realize later, oh yeah, I still need SharePoint for these other things. So they don't really get rid of it. It's more of an and. And then that and becomes, so should I use which one? Which place is best for which type of thing that I'm trying to do?
Thank you. That's an awesome.
Anybody else?
Got a quiet crew today.
Yeah. And I know I'm shoveling a lot of info. I have one more slide of info that I want to show you, and then my recommendation. And then anything that needs to be demoed or you guys want to see, I can actually demo it in the time that we have left. But there's a lot of information that I wanted to make sure that you were aware of. And because April and Bob had already done a lot of demoing, I cut kind of my demoing parts out. But I could still bring them back if you guys need. Members inside of teams. You can have up to 5,000 in the commercial space, and including in those org-wide teams, up to 2,500 in GCC and GCC High. I also have a video that I did, I think about a year or so ago, to around the same time frame that I did about the differences between commercial GCC and GCC High. Now you can go back and watch it. I actually included it in my resources slides. Just note the timestamp and that some things have changed. Remember my cloud disclaimer, because things have changed for GCC and GCC High, although I know there's still no complete parity, and it never will be, because GCC and GCC High features have to be rigorously tested, certified, compliant before they can be released to those environments. So the other thing is Office 365 groups can actually be used as permission groups across SharePoint, across all of the site collections in SharePoint. The same thing with groups that are created when you create the Microsoft Teams, because remember, when you create Microsoft Teams, an Office 365 group is created. That group can be used as a permission group in SharePoint. But one of the things I actually didn't put here, now that I'm rereading this, I thought I updated this point, was that you can actually use it for Power Automate security groups. So if you've ever done any Power Automate or previously Microsoft Flow, you notice that the only security groups that you can use are those that are in Office 365 groups that you would create, either a security group or emailed security group, or your Office 365 groups, which was added a bit later. So first it was just email enabled and security groups. Those were the only two. Security groups and email enabled security groups were the only two you could use for Power Automate, or as it was known as Flow. Now you can use Office 365 groups there too. So that can expand your ability to secure things in a way that makes sense for your organization. So if you have a flow that actually maps to a certain team, that only they should be the ones to be able to manage and maintain this flow, instead of making the owner of that flow or Power Automate, instead of making the owner one or two people, you can actually assign it to a team. So when people leave the team, other people join the team, there's nobody ever not able to manage the flow or Power Automate, which used to happen in the past. Somebody would create one of those Power Automates, they'd leave the company, all of a sudden, who can make changes to it? This flow is kind of out there just flowing by itself. Nobody that can do anything with that. So it's kind of the same permission scenario as we've had in SharePoint in the past, making expanses on that so that we don't get locked out of our Power Automate. We don't get locked out of certain things like the SharePoint site collection, or get locked out of the team. We can actually have those permission groups, use permission groups instead of individual people. That way, if they leave or transition, the ball isn't dropped there. And then, yes, there's an app for that. And what I mean by an app for that, there's an app for SharePoint and there's an app for Microsoft Teams. There was one for Office 365 groups, but again, groups, think of it as infrastructure and not an experience. To make that more real, Microsoft has gotten rid of the Office 365 groups app. So that app has been discontinued. Okay, I'm just going to check because that was my last slide before my recommendations. So let me just go to my recommendations. So I got a couple of recommendations which actually line up to Microsoft recommendations as well, which is stop using Office 365 groups. Use Teams. If you need an Office 365 group, use Teams. If you have Office 365 groups now, transition to Teams. Now, this isn't in the roadmap, and this is kind of a Nikki-ism, not a Microsoft thing, at least not yet. But reading the tea leaves, I really believe that at some point, Office 365 groups are going to become inaccessible to you to be able to get to them anymore through Exchange. They're going to become true infrastructure, and you are not going to be able to access any of your stuff that was in those groups. So transition or convert them to Teams. And really, it's really easy to teamify an Office 365 group. So I'll show you that in a, well, actually, I'm almost out of time, so I can't show you that. But one of the things that I did do, just in case I ran out of time and there were some things that I wanted to show you or people asked, before I joined Microsoft, I did a conference, SP TechCon in Boston last year. So there's the link to that. Just remember the cloud disclaimer because things I'm sure have changed since I did this. But the concepts are basically the same, where you can see how I actually showed the audience there how they can teamify their groups. So it's not a hard thing to teamify. And I used the word transition. I probably shouldn't use that for those of you who have done migrations before. Transition and migration are probably like, I don't want to do that. That's going to be a lot of heartache and pain and hurt on my part and a lot of time. It doesn't take any time at all. There's literally clicks of buttons that you do to teamify your group. And also to be able to take that classic site collection that I was telling you about, if you needed the full features of a classic site collection, be able to groupify that and then be able to teamify it is just a few steps with clicks. There's no migration involved. So sorry if the word transition freaked you out a little bit, but you're good. It's not going to be a whole lot of pain. So I wanted to ask any final questions. And while I'm asking about any final questions, I also wanted to point out that I do have reference material in here. And at the end is those videos that I was telling you about Office 365 commercial versus GCC high and GCC, and the modern site gotcha, which includes Office 365 site collections, SharePoint site collections created by Office 365 groups, created by Microsoft Teams, or ones that you might have created using modern sites, which are those communication sites. So just going back to seeing if there's any final questions.
Guys, the floor is open for questions for a few more minutes.
Those are great resources that you just had up, Nikki. Those will be useful.
Thank you. And I hope I didn't bore you guys to death with all of the PowerPointage, but because, again, the demo was so heavy with April and Bob, they showed you things that I was already going to show you. I decided to add more data points and make sure that I explain the data points a bit better than jumping straight into demo.
Yeah. I guess a question that I have is really around where do you see people screwing this up? I don't know how else to say that, but like, what are the big things that you're seeing that people are making mistakes on that we can, and I know you touched on that a little bit, but that we can make sure that we call out really loud and clear, like, don't do this one thing, no matter what.
Well, if I would say the big one thing would be do not create any more Office 365 groups. I'm just, again, I made a prediction a while ago about how Office 365 groups were going to become, actually, I did this about 2 years ago. we're going to become more infrastructure. We're probably going to become permission groups that we can use, but getting to the actual group was going to be a thing that would be of the past, and that it would just be Teams and SharePoint. We've already gotten halfway through that prediction. So not saying I'm a guru, I'm not psychic. I don't have any internal, even working for Microsoft, I'm not privy to the roadmap like as such, because I'm not on the development team. I'm on the partner team. But just knowing, having the experience with Microsoft that I've had over all of these years, and if you think back, you'd realize that it actually is a thing that you probably know about too, that Office 365 groups, like they said, are becoming infrastructure. It's probably going to go away as a thing that you can create. Save yourself the heartache for when Microsoft announces that you only got blah, blah time to uh, get off of groups, and just transition now. It's very, very, not use the word transition, just teamify your groups. It's very easy to do.
I wrote down 3/19/2020, Nikki predicts. Got it written down. So we will see. I like the term teamify too. That's an awesome term.
Yeah, that's a cool term too. We used to use the word groupify, and now we say teamify.
Very, very nice. It is great information. I'm sure people are very appreciative of your insights here.
Well, thank you so much, guys. Since looks like I'm pretty much out of time, and then isn't any more questions.
Appreciate it, Nikki. Thank you.
Just want to say thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference. There's more to come.